Russian President Vladimir Putin is adding to his list of nuclear partners in West Africa. Now, the latest country ready to join hands with Russia in the nuclear market is Sierra Leone. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov hosted his counterpart from Sierra Leone, Timothy Musakaba, in Moscow for talks that focus primarily on collaboration in nuclear energy. Moscow and Freetown also discussed the prospects of constructing a nuclear power plant in Sierra Leone.
On se sent en famille en ce sens que la Russie est une famille aussi pour l'Afrique. C'est une famille parce que nous avons la même histoire. La Russie a consenti d'énormes sacrifices pour libérer le monde du nazisme pendant la Seconde Guerre mondiale. Les peuples africains, nos grands-pères, ont été déportés de force aussi pour aider l'Europe à se débarrasser du nazisme. Nous partageons la même histoire en ce sens que nous sommes les peuples oubliés du monde.
While Trump shuts the door on over 50 nations, Putin opens new ones: nuclear energy, resource control, a Russian-backed gold refinery built on African soil. This isn't charity, it's strategy.
Including Yemen, Somalia.
The relationship between the Soviet Union and Africa was very crucial for the liberation of Africa. As I told you, in South Africa, by 1900, the whole of African continent had been colonized, except for Ethiopia.
The first signs of trouble appeared quietly, buried deep inside Europe's energy reports. Analysts noticed unusual shipping delays, strange rerouting patterns, and reductions in resource allocations from suppliers they had depended on for decades. At first, they assumed it was a logistical glitch or a temporary bottleneck, but within 72 hours, the truth emerged and the shock hit Europe like an earthquake. Russia and Africa had executed a coordinated geopolitical maneuver so precise, so synchronized, and so unexpected that it caught the entire European Union off guard. It was not a military move, not a diplomatic warning, and not a trade dispute. It was something far more devastating. Russia and Africa had created a new supply corridor, one that diverted critical resources away from Europe entirely. It began in the northern corridors of Russia's energy network, where new pipelines and shipping routes suddenly shifted their output east and south instead of west. At the same time, Africa activated its newly built export terminals, processing plants, and resource hubs across western, southern, and central regions. These facilities, many developed through partnerships with Russia, began redirecting their most valuable exports away from European markets: oil, gas, uranium, platinum, cobalt, nickel, grain, fertilizer, the very materials Europe needed to power factories, grow food, stabilize energy grids, and sustain its industries were now flowing. Along routes controlled jointly by Russia and Africa and Europe was not included. The shock was so sudden that European leaders initially assumed the reports were incomplete, but as the hours passed, confirmations poured in from intelligence units, satellite feeds, naval monitoring teams, and commodity traders worldwide. Russia and Africa had isolated Europe, and they had done it without firing a single shot. For years, Europe believed Africa was too divided to form a unified strategy, and that Russia was too focused on its own conflicts to build new alliances, but both assumptions were catastrophically wrong. Quietly, behind the scenes, Russia and Africa had been working together, building logistics networks, signing resource agreements, developing shared digital infrastructure, and planning a new economic corridor independent of Western influence. Their partnership was not built on ideology, it was built on leverage. Russia offered energy, military technology, and global bargaining power. Africa offered resources, demographics, land, and emerging manufacturing hubs. Together, they formed an alliance capable of disrupting the global balance overnight. Europe's first emergency meeting was chaotic. Ministers spoke over one another, intelligence officers struggled to provide clear timelines, and economic advisors warned that the EU's most vulnerable sectors could collapse if the resource flow was not restored. But what troubled them most was not the loss of resources, it was the realization that Russia and Africa had planned this for years. Satellite images revealed the construction of massive new African industrial zones funded by Russian capital. Reports showed joint naval exercises in strategic waters previously ignored by Europe. Trade logs confirmed multi-year contracts signed outside European oversight, and new digital payment systems between Russia and Africa eliminated the need for EU banks entirely. Europe had been focusing on sanctions, diplomacy, and eastward tensions. Meanwhile, Russia and Africa were building an entirely new economic architecture behind. The curtain energy markets reacted instantly. Prices surged. European utilities scrambled to secure alternatives, only to discover that other countries had already signed supply agreements with Russia and Africa in anticipation of the shift. Grain markets were hit next. Africa, once dependent on European imports, was now exporting surplus harvests through Russian shipping lines. European supermarkets saw food prices spike nearly overnight. Investors panicked, currency markets trembled, and European manufacturing sectors began calculating the losses. In public, EU officials reassured citizens that everything was under control. Behind closed doors, panic spread through every level of Europe's political and economic institutions. They had underestimated Africa, and they had miscalculated Russia's strategic depth. Africa's leaders, previously fragmented by competing interests and foreign pressure, now moved with unprecedented unity. They issued a joint declaration stating that Africa would decide when, how, and to whom its resources flowed, and that Europe's era of automatic access was over. Russia reinforced the message by announcing new long-term commitments with African partners that would prioritize their shared economic zone over all other markets. Europe was not named directly, but the implication was unmistakable. The EU had been sidelined. The most shocking revelation of all came when a leaked intelligence report exposed the existence of a Russia-Africa resource stabilization system, a coordinated mechanism designed to control global prices by adjusting supply flows. If activated, it would allow Russia and Africa to manipulate the availability of oil, minerals, and agricultural goods across Europe, potentially triggering shortages. The discovery sent shivers through European governments. They knew what this meant. Russia and Africa had built the power to destabilize Europe at will. Transport routes were also shifting. Russia's new rail extensions through Central Asia and Africa's expanding port systems on the Atlantic and Indian Ocean were operating together. Like synchronized gears, cargo once destined for European ports was now being rerouted to Asia, South America, and the Middle East. Europe was no longer the preferred market. It was now the last option. For decades, Africa supplied Europe because it had no choice. European companies set prices, dictated terms, and treated the continent as a dependency. But now Africa had alternatives, global alternatives, profitable alternatives, strategic alternatives, and it chose Russia. The implications were historic. Europe was witnessing the collapse of a geopolitical assumption it had relied on for generations, that Africa would always need Europe more than Europe needed Africa. That assumption was now dead. Russia and Africa had done the unthinkable. They had isolated the entire European Union. The world was changing, and Europe was no longer at the center of it. Europe entered the second day of the crisis with a level of confusion it had not experienced in decades. Every department, from energy to agriculture to defense, was scrambling for answers. Yet no matter how many emergency meetings they held, no matter how many analysts they summoned, the conclusion remained the same. Russia and Africa had completely reshaped global supply routes, and Europe was now on the outside looking in. The EU attempted to downplay the situation publicly, insisting that alternative markets would make up for the sudden loss of Russian and African exports. But the reality behind the scenes was brutal. The alternatives were either too expensive, too unstable, or already locked in by countries that anticipated the shift and acted faster. Then Europe. Cargo ships that once sailed automatically toward European ports were now bypassing them entirely, heading instead to Asia, the Middle East, and newly upgraded African terminals. Europe's influential industries, automotive, chemical, aerospace, food processing, and pharmaceuticals felt the pressure first. These sectors relied heavily on African minerals, Russian energy, and agricultural inputs from both regions. Without them, production lines slowed, delayed, then halted. Factories that once operated with precision suddenly faced shortages of cobalt, manganese, aluminum, wheat, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and petroleum-based inputs. Germany saw manufacturing declines it had not experienced since the early 2000s. Italy's agricultural exporters struggled to keep up with rising input costs. France issued warnings about energy rationing for industrial districts. Smaller EU economies, especially those in Eastern and Southern Europe, feared economic collapse if supply disruptions continued. Meanwhile, Russia and Africa were expanding their cooperation with astonishing speed. They announced new joint energy hubs, agricultural corridors, and mineral alliances designed to strengthen their strategic independence. For the first time, Africa was exporting refined materials, not just raw minerals, thanks to processing plants built with Russian technology. This single shift devastated Europe's pricing power. For decades, European companies purchased raw African materials cheaply, then added most of the value in European factories. But now Africa was controlling more of the value chain, keeping more profit at home, and selling finished or semi-finished goods to markets outside Europe. The EU suddenly found itself competing with Africa instead of extracting from it. In Moscow, leaders emphasized that the partnership was meant to balance global fairness. In Africa, the narrative was far more direct. Europe was finally experiencing the consequences of decades of lopsided trade. The continent had grown tired of dependency, tired of being treated as a market for Europe's finished goods while receiving little in return. Russia helped Africa break that pattern, and Africa embraced the opportunity wholeheartedly. Europe tried diplomacy next. Several EU representatives contacted African governments, requesting emergency consultations, but Africa responded with carefully coordinated messages that shocked European diplomats. Negotiations would only take place through the Russia-Africa Joint Trade Council, a new institution created just weeks before the crisis, but powerful enough to dictate continental strategy. Europe was stunned. It was the first time Africa had created a unified negotiation structure specifically to manage foreign access. Russia's influence was evident in every detail. The Council demanded that Europe recognize Africa's right to control its own pricing, regulate its own supply chains, and determine its own trade priorities. Without European interference, for a continent accustomed to setting terms, not receiving them, the shift was humiliating, but the shock did not end there. Russia revealed that it had facilitated new African energy grids powered by nuclear mini-reactors, reactors built with Russian assistance, designed to eliminate Africa's dependency on European energy technologies. Europe realized with dread that its decades of influence over Africa's power sector were evaporating. The continent was moving toward energy independence, which meant it could choose its partners freely. Meanwhile, Africa's agricultural output surged thanks to Russian fertilizers and machinery. Countries that once imported grain from Europe were now exporting to Asia and the Middle East through Russia's transportation networks. Europe's markets, once the priority destination, were receiving nothing. As days passed, Europe's media shifted from shock to blame. Some blamed Africa for abandoning long-standing partnerships. Others accused Russia of orchestrating a geopolitical trap. But none of these narratives changed the reality that Europe had ignored Africa for too long, treating it as a resource basket rather than a strategic equal. Russia and Africa capitalized on Europe's missteps. They launched a joint commodity exchange that priced minerals, grains, and energy resources in non-EU currencies. The platform exploded in popularity as Asian and Middle Eastern buyers flocked to it, eager to avoid European regulations and currency fluctuations. Europe's financial institutions panicked. The euro weakened as global markets adjusted to the new reality. Investors abandoned European commodities and redirected capital toward Russian and African markets experiencing explosive growth. Banks warned that if Europe didn't secure new supply deals soon, it could face long-term inflation and industrial stagnation. Europe attempted a third strategy, intense lobbying through the United Nations and other international bodies, but Russia and Africa had anticipated this as well. Africa, once underrepresented in global decision-making, was now heavily supported by Russian diplomats who amplified Africa's voice with every opportunity. The message was simple. Africa was no longer Europe's junior partner. It was a sovereign global actor. As pressure mounted inside Europe, internal unity began to crack. Northern European countries blamed southern nations for failing to invest in diversification earlier. Eastern European countries accused Western nations of ignoring Russian influence for too long. The EU-US internal disagreements played right into Russia's strategy divide and weaken Europe's ability to respond effectively. Meanwhile, Africa was moving forward with confidence. Joint infrastructure projects accelerated. New training academies opened, welcoming African engineers, scientists, and technicians to learn Russian aerospace, agriculture, and energy technologies. African militaries adopted Russian equipment, strengthening the strategic alliance. And as Africa grew stronger, Europe grew more desperate, the continent that once prided itself. Instability was now facing a future dictated by Russia and Africa, two regions Europe had underestimated for years. The isolation was not simply economic. It was geopolitical. Russia and Africa had redrawn the map of global power. Europe was forced to confront the truth. The world no longer revolved around the European Union. The new centers of influence were rising elsewhere in the East and in Africa. The partnership between Russia and Africa had reshaped the global order, leaving Europe struggling to find a role in a world where it was no longer the undisputed power.